Hi guys, this video is to go over a couple of the topics that I would love to go over with you in person, but we're going to save a little time and flip the classroom so you can kind of do these notes at night so that we have more time in class for some of our activities and labs. For this particular set of notes that I'm doing here on this video, I do not have a separate note guide for you. They follow Smead's topic guide pretty well. I've added a few things in extra, so you might want to make some notes or maybe grab an extra piece of paper so you can jot down some of those things and then just kind of add it into your topic guide or add it into your notes. But feel free to fill in Smead's topic guide as we do these couple of topics. So I'm going to start with 5.5 irrigation. We've already talked about the impacts of agriculture, and we've talked about pest management. We've talked a little bit about integrated pest management. So I'm going to hit with you irrigation and a little bit on sustainable farming. And then in class, we'll cover the last bits of agriculture. Okay. Alrighty, so main types of irrigation. You will see from reading your book that there's a bunch of them. Furrow irrigation, flood irrigation, drip irrigation, and spray irrigation. What do you need to know? You need to know how each of them work, generally speaking, and also, more importantly, which ones are the most efficient and which ones are the least efficient. Furrow irrigation and flood irrigation are definitely in the least efficient categories. With furrow irrigation, we basically dig trenches along the sides of crops or between the crops, and then we'll use a body of water and channel that body of water towards those trenches. The water will flow down into the trenches and water the soil along the crops. It's easy to do, so this is a practice that's used in a lot of places because it is very easy to do and it's very inexpensive to do. Water seeps into the soil just as it runs down through the trench. As it says there, it's about 66% efficient. The biggest problem, though, is you have a lot of water loss due to just the runoff, and more so due to evaporation. So once this water gets into the trenches, you're going to lose a bunch of it to evaporation, particularly if you're in a warm, sunny place. The next one, the flood irrigation, also rather inefficient. As we talk about efficiency, it's about 80% efficient. You still get a lot of runoff. You still get a lot of evaporation. What this one does is they basically flood the field, right? You'll see this a lot with like rice and cranberry type of farming, where that's what the crops need. They need that temporary wetland in order to grow. So it's pretty easy to do. Again, they just will flood. They will divert water from usually from a surface body of water like a river or a lake or something like that, and allow it to overflow into the field and waterlog the field. That waterlogging can be a good thing. Like I said, some crops actually need that. If they don't, or if the water sits there too long, it can actually do what's called waterlogging or cause soil salinization and drown the plants. And we're going to hopefully have some time to do the soil salinization lab, where we'll actually look at what is soil salinization, what impact does it have on crops, and then also we can tie that into what's called LD and ED50, taking a look at what are lethal and effective doses of certain toxins. But moving on, we're going to move down to the bottom right there, which is spray irrigation. You've probably seen spray irrigation. If you've ever driven out through the country, like if you've ever driven out to the beach, like if you've gone to Rehoboth Beach or any kind of the beaches in Maryland and stuff like that, as you're driving after the Chesapeake Bay, as you're driving through the cornfields to get over to the beach, you will see these great big booms kind of coming off of the irrigation tower, spreading that water across the field. And so it's kind of like the central pivot place where they pump the water up, and then it comes out through these arms and sprays over the field. A lot of times, sometimes they're like straight and you can see that they're on wheels and they'll like roll across the field. Other times they are kind of a central pivot place where the water is pumped up, and then it's a rotating arm that goes around that pivot point. But the idea is that we're basically pumping water up. A lot of times we're using water out of groundwater in these places, not necessarily surface water. pumping water up from the ground, from an aquifer, and using it to spray across the field. This one is a little bit better, right? You have a little bit less evaporation with it, but it is more expensive because you're going to require the pumps themselves, the devices to do this, the electricity and the energy needed to actually run these things. So it works a little bit better in terms of efficiency for using the water well, but it's a little bit more materials intensive and it's expensive. The last one up there in that top right is drip irrigation. This one's the best, right? If we could afford to do this for everything, that would be a fantastic idea in terms of water conservation, because in terms of water use, it's about 95% efficient. And what it is basically if you take a hose, right, run it out along your crops and poke holes in that hose, and the water is just going to slowly drip out straight onto the soil. So there's not much room for it to evaporate. You can control, usually how much or how little is going out there. It avoids the waterlogging issue. It avoids the salinization issue, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Really, this is the best possible option. However, you can imagine running a rubber hose through miles and miles of corn, all the different rows of corn or whatever soy or whatever crop it is. It also isn't the most efficient thing to do in terms of materials and energy needed to produce those things. So typically the drip irrigation isn't used widely for huge crops, right? A lot of times it's used on more kind of smaller vegetable crops and things like that. Here's another picture, right, of just kind of those types of irrigation that we talked about. So on the left there, you see the gravity flow, right, or kind of those furrow irrigation. You actually see the drip irrigation in the middle, right, with these trees. You can see kind of the central hose going out and then several smaller hoses kind of going out and circling the trees and dripping water along the trees there. And then finally you have that spray irrigation, which you see on the very end. And that happens to be one where there's a center pivot going around, pumping up water through the middle, spraying it out through that arm that circulates around. When you're flying in an airplane, particularly over like our Southwest and stuff, a lot of times you can see in the dry desert, you'll see some of these areas where there's like these really nice green circles, and that's what that is. That is a place where we have in the desert made it farmable land by adding that irrigation strategy there. Right. So here's just a couple of solutions for irrigation and making it better, right? So the line canals, another thing that farmers will do to avoid kind of too much runoff is actually leveling the fields with lasers so that the ground is completely flat, so that you don't have that, or it's at the angle that it needs to be, so that you don't have too much runoff and causing soil erosion or losing too much water. Irrigating at night, simple solution, right? It's not as hot. You're going to reduce evaporation. The other thing is there's a lot more monitoring of soil moisture than there used to be. So not just this kind of blind watering until we think it needs it. There's a lot more science that goes into agriculture. Actually, really, really cool stuff to make everything much more sustainable, so that we don't waste water and we don't waste materials. There's a couple of other things on this list here as well that you can read over. Right. Another thing is looking at which crops grow best in which places naturally. So not growing water intensive crops in the middle of the desert, things like that. Polyculture, right? Using things, and we're going to talk about a bunch of these things when we get to sustainable agriculture in a couple of slides. Let me move on to waterlogging. What is waterlogging? Well, it is when you pretty much give your soil too much water, right? Sometimes we do the waterlogging on purpose if there's a crop that requires it, like I said, like cranberries or rice. But basically the idea is that we're going to overwater or saturate the soil. This is going to fill all of the spaces. Remember, we talked about porosity and permeability. This is going to fill all those pores with water. Sounds great, right? Plants love water, but don't forget, they also need oxygen. They need oxygen so that the plants can do cellular respiration and can grow. And so if you end up filling all the spaces with water, there's no oxygen and they're not getting it and they won't grow, or they might actually die. So as you can see here, it can stunt the growth of the crops. Like I said, the solution to this is using that drip irrigation so we're not overwatering. Another idea is, we've talked about it before, is that soil irrigation where, and you'll see sometimes machines will go along through if you have an actual turf, or I'm sorry, not turf field, but like a grass field, like a grass soccer field or a grass football field, where they go through and they pop up those little pellets of dirt. That is this idea of soil aeration, right? Kind of poking holes into the soil so the water can drain better and that the air can actually get in and allow for the air to mix and the oxygen to mix in. So there you see a little bit of a picture of it, and unfortunately my picture's in the way. But you can see the aeration right there, kind of poking those holes in the soil to allow water to drain a little bit better and air to get in there. Soil salinization. You guys are going to learn a lot about this because we're going to do a whole entire lab on this. And this is basically, so what causes this, right? Well, if we waterlog or we overwater, we can cause soil salinization. And soil salinization is basically the buildup of salts in the soil. If we use groundwater or if we use some water that's not entirely from a fresh water source, right? If it happens to have some salt water mixed in with it, and we spray that onto our fields, it goes onto the soil, and as the water evaporates out or the water drains away, it's leaving behind salts and minerals. Kind of like if you were to take a cup of salt water, let the water evaporate out of it, you would be left with this kind of thing of salt left behind and minerals left behind. Groundwater tends to have a higher mineral content to it that will make it not salt water, but have a little bit more of kind of that those characteristics to it. And so if you're using groundwater, you're pumping water out of an aquifer to spray onto a field, the water evaporates or it drains back away. It's leaving behind salt on top of the soil. Some of the soil will actually start to appear white, and you can tell that it kind of gets covered in salt. And so you can imagine if you have enough salt, it's going to be a poison. It's going to be a toxin to the plants. So it can, again, stunt the growth of the plants. It can kill the plants, those types of things. We'll do a whole investigation on this. So what are some of the solutions? Again, drip irrigation, soil aeration. If you flush it, if you spray the field with water that you know is truly, truly fresh water that isn't going to leave behind that mineral content, that can also help get rid of the problem. But this is a big problem in a lot of places around the world, is the soil salinization. We're going to talk a little bit more about human water use after this unit. I'm going to kind of plug this in, but just so you guys are kind of aware, water use is a big issue in environmental science. And there's a lot of different things that we use water for. Of course, we think most commonly about the municipal use, which makes up about 19%. Municipal use is talking about what's the water that we use in our homes and our buildings and our daily life, right? It's the water we cook with. It's the water we clean with. It's the water we wash our cars with and do our laundry with, and the water we drink, all that kind of stuff. That's our municipal. It's the water we use to flush our toilets, right? That is the municipal water. That only makes up about 20% of all of the water that humans use. Okay, about 11% is used for industry, whether that be for power plants, right? In the cooling towers, we're going to learn all about how power plants actually work in a couple of units and how we use water in that process. We turn water into steam. Steam turns the turbines. We also use water in industries to run machinery, to cool machinery and things like that. But as you can tell from that graph, right, the biggest use of water on the planet, 70% of water use by humans is for agriculture, right? Watering not only the crops that we eat, but the crops that animals eat, that we're going to then eat the animals. It's water that we use to actually for the livestock so that they have something to drink, the water that we use in every process of agriculture into creating our food. All right, aquifers and groundwater. Again, I'm going to pop into this topic with you guys a little bit more in a little bit because I want to make sure that we do this justice. But what is an aquifer? An aquifer is really just a fancy name for where groundwater is stored, right? A lot of times we think of groundwater as, being like a big pool of water under the ground. And most of the time it's not. Occasionally you might have, some caves or something like that are filled up with water. For the most part, groundwater and aquifers is all the water that's contained in the pores between the particles of soil and the particles of rock. And this is the type of water that we actually use a lot for drinking water and for irrigation on the planet. You can see in this picture, there's two kinds of aquifers. There is an unconfined aquifer and a confined aquifer. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with this for you guys whenever we talk about aquifers later. But an unconfined aquifer basically means there is permeable surface above the aquifer. So think our sand, our silt, our clay, right? Or our loam, hopefully. And that's going to allow water from rain and snow to seep down, infiltrate into the ground, and fill up those spaces between the rocks. That's usually what we're pulling from, right? Good thing about that is it can replenish relatively quickly. Remember, we talked about the different types of soil and how each one has kind of characteristics about how fast it's going to move through or how well it's going to filter out toxins. So the type of soil that is above this unconfined aquifer can make a big difference on what kind of contaminants can get into the aquifer, and also how quickly is it going to recharge or refill so that we can pull water from it. The confined aquifer is when you basically have an impermeable layer above and below the water table, or the groundwater there. We'll talk about what the water table is later. And there's only going to be one or two places where it can recharge or can actually refill from precipitation. So these tend to fill up much slower. They also tend to usually be cleaner because they've had more time to kind of fill up. When we pull water from those, though, they tend to deplete faster because they recharge or replenish so slowly. Okay. All right, here's just kind of some trade-offs. As you guys can see, there's advantages and disadvantages to using groundwater, to using aquifers. Typically, they tend to be available year-round. So if it's wintertime and you have to worry about a lake freezing over, something like that, groundwater doesn't. If you have to worry about summertime and too much water evaporating out of a river or a lake, right? Again, don't have to worry about it if it's underground. If we use them sustainably, if we take water out at the same rate that we're allowing it to recharge, it can be a great renewable resource, right? But that's one of those things where we have to be very careful about how quickly we're removing water from the aquifers. They also tend to be cheaper and easier to get to. Think about a well, right? People who are using well water to supply for drinking water at their home or for irrigating, right? All I've got to do is drill down, get to that tap water or get to that groundwater, and find a way to pump it up to the surface. And then you can see there's a bunch of trade-offs, right? And we'll talk about a couple of those. We've talked about kind of the pollutants getting into the aquifers before. I've got a slide here for you about the sinking of land. If we take water out too quickly, that can be a problem. There's also an issue with saltwater intrusion, and we'll take a look at that in one of our current events as well. All right, one of the things you guys really need to be familiar with, like really truly, is the Ogallala Aquifer. It is the world's largest aquifer, and it is here in the United States, and it takes up most of our Midwest, right? So you can imagine that's where a lot of our Midwestern farmers are getting the water that they are using to irrigate their crops. I've got a little video for you guys that you can watch separately. Okay. Here's a good picture for you guys, kind of some of those effects of overpumping. So here we see an unconfined aquifer. There's permeable surface on top, right? Down here we see on the left a major irrigation well that is sucking the water out of it. The water table is the top level of which the ground is saturated with water. Above that is the zone of aeration. If you happen to be next to a place that has seawater and that aquifer is attached or runs into the sea area, what can happen is this actually happens with sea level rise too. As the sea level increases and comes over the permeable land, what will happen is that salt water will actually start to percolate down into the aquifer and contaminate it with salt water. The other thing is if we drain the aquifer too much and it eventually starts basically sucking salt water in, that can happen to it as well. So we have to be very careful about kind of that saltwater intrusion and how we're handling those aquifers. Like I said, we'll take a little closer look at aquifers and depletion of aquifers and saltwater intrusion a little bit later. But this was a cool headline from a couple of years ago. Basically, some farmers in Florida were trying to protect their crops by spraying them with water before frost came through. And we can talk about that a little bit later too. But what they did was they depleted their aquifer faster than it could replenish. And you can imagine if you've got ground, right? You got water filling the spaces of that ground and they take away all of the water. What ended up happening was the ground collapsed. So a lot of times when you hear stories about sinkholes and stuff like that, particularly in the Midwest, they're caused by overconsumption of groundwater. This picture on the right here is an entire home that has been swallowed up by a sinkhole. So that line coming in is the driveway, and then in that entire hole is somebody's home. And I do believe that there was actually somebody sleeping at the time that that house collapsed and got sucked into the sinkhole. I'm going to let you guys watch that video on your own. Okay, I'm not going to talk a ton about sustainable agriculture because we're going to watch a movie and you guys are going to see all the best of sustainable agriculture from the movie, and you're going to love the movie too. All right, so sustainable agriculture, what's it all about? Remember, sustainability is enough for all forever. How can we manage agriculture so that there's enough for everybody to eat and drink now and forever? So what do we have to do? We've got to make sure that we preserve the topsoil, we preserve moisture, we allow decomposition to happen naturally, and we don't add all the synthetic fertilizers. And so there's a lot of things that we can do to kind of help soil conservation and water conservation to make farming more efficient. So in terms of soil conservation, there's a couple of different things that we have. There is contour farming. And I'm sure you guys have seen pictures like this before, but it's basically when we create our fields to mimic and kind of mirror the actual landscape, the contours of the land. And what it does is by doing that, we're allowing these kind of shallow little terraces for the water to get stuck on or stuck between, so that it doesn't run off and wash all the soil away, or reduce too much of the water that we're using as well. Terracing is similar, but this one's a little bit different. This is where we literally cut like steps into a steep hillside. So if you have a very steep slope, right, and you don't want to water that because the water is going to run off really quickly. So it's not going to be efficient use of water. It's going to take the soil with it. But if we build these terraces or these steps into the side of the land and you water, right, the water lands on that step and stays there. So it's a great way to kind of prevent water loss and soil loss where you have really steep slopes. You guys should have read a little bit about perennial crops when you did the pest management FYL, right? Perennial crops are the type of crops that stay around year long. We can harvest them and then they're still going to leave something behind afterwards to help continue nutrient cycling and growing and replenish the soil a little bit. So we're not always pulling stuff out of the soil and depleting it. Windbreaks are kind of just what they sound like, right? It is a way, if you think about a really nice, big, wide, flat field, great for growing things, right? Super easy to plant on and manage. But the problem is when the wind whips by, right, we're going to have lots of soil erosion happening or damage to the crops happening from the fierce winds that'll sweep across a flat area. So what do? You plant tall stuff to break up the wind. So here's a good picture for you, right? Kind of think of it in terms of like the rain shadow effect, but not just in terms of the flow of the wind, not in terms of the moisture. But you see the prevailing winds here, they come in, they hit the trees. The trees actually help slow the wind down and kind of divert it above the crops right there and above the soil there. So we don't have as much erosion or as much damage to the actual crops. No-till, pretty self-explanatory, right? We don't turn up the soil after we've done harvesting or to get it ready for the next planting. Instead, we're going to leave all of the organic matter there, allow it to decompose, kind of adding a layer of nutrients to the soil instead. And I have a picture that I'll show you guys of that in just a moment. And then strip cropping is also called intercropping. And again, you should have seen this with the pest management stuff, this idea of alternating rows or a couple rows of different things. And these, when you strip crop or you intercrop, there's so many benefits to it, right? From soil conservation to water conservation to providing pollinator habitat from pollinators that will like to eat one particular type of crop and will help pollinate another one. If you looked at your GMOs gizmo, right, one of the things that they had was having that reserve field of no GMOs so that there was a natural place for the predators to live. All kinds of great benefits to strip cropping. Here is a good picture. I blew this one up for you guys, or I enlarged this one for you, of the difference between no-tilled and tilled soil. And you can see with the no-tilled soil, there's a much thicker organic layer, right? It's going to retain more water because there's plant roots in there, right? That soil is going to be more porous. It's going to help to trap some of the moisture. With the plants and the roots there, you're going to reduce the runoff. So there's really a lot of benefits to the no-till system. The other thing is, if you have that natural decomposition, you're maintaining that natural ecosystem. You're maintaining habitat for your worms and your insects that are going to create those natural channels of aeration in the soil. If you till it, unfortunately, right, a lot of times we're kind of getting too much soil turning up. It makes it looser. It makes it easier for it to actually run off, right? We have increased microbial activity because we might have too much air getting down in there, right? Because remember, there's just like anything, there's got to be just the right amount of air, oxygen, nitrogen, things like that to support the roots of plants. Think about a lot of the plants, right? And we learned about the nitrogen cycle and how the roots of plants are going to take up nitrogen. So we actually need some of that nitrogen in the air to get down there. But you can see a lot more problems with the tilled soil. Alrighty. Crop rotation, right, we mentioned. I'll let you guys kind of flip through these a little bit more. One of the things that I mentioned to you guys, we did this in my little garden in Savannah, as I found that after my first year or two of planting in it, I had depleted the soil of some stuff. So I had to start rotating around what I was planting where in the garden. One of the best things to add to your garden are legumes, right? The peas and the beans. They have, remember, that nitrogen fixing bacteria, that rhizobium in their root nodules. If you ever pull up clover, you ever pull up beans, and you see there's little nodule, like little knots, little bubbles. They look like bubbles on the roots. And those are actually home to the bacteria that are going to help work to restore things like nitrogen in the soil. Okay. So here again, really good picture for you guys of kind of that legume-based cropping system, right? We see the nitrogen gas from the air. Remember that nitrogen cycle, right? These little bubbles or nodules on the roots that help to fix the nitrogen and put it into a form that the plants can actually reabsorb and use. All right, green manure is basically using plants, not poop in this particular case, but plants, right? Plant waste to remain on the field or spreading it on the field so that it can decompose, right? And add nutrients back to the soil. So here you see a tractor going through, right? Cutting down the crop, but not pulling it up, just leaving it there to decompose. It's going to help to hold moisture in to the soil, help reduce a lot of the erosion from water and wind, and add nutrients back to the soil as well. And again, here's another picture for you of what that looks like, right? Kind of adding what we call green manure, right? Allowing some plants to kind of grow naturally in the winter time, chop them down, allow them to kind of decompose and replenish the soil in the spring. And then we have nice organic matter to use in the summertime for growing our crops. Lastly, one of the solutions we have is limestone. So one of the things that will leach materials, important nutrients and vitamins out of the soil is if it is acidic. Most soil is naturally somewhat acidic. We also have some problems when we get to acid rain and air pollution. We'll talk about acid rain coming down. If your soil becomes more acidic, it's going to leach out those minerals faster. So if we add limestone, it changes the acidity, makes it more basic so that those minerals will not leach and kind of bleed out of your soil. They'll stay in the soil better. So this is a really great way to keep nutrients in the soil naturally. Last one there is rotational grazing, right? Just like you want to rotate your crops, you want to rotate where your critters are grazing. If you don't, right, you're going to end up with very stunted root growth. The plant simply won't be able to grow quite as much. The ground, the soil will get compacted and the air won't be able to get in there. Here's a good look at what roots actually look like, whether you're allowing your critters to come through and eat them every week, every 2 weeks, or every 4 weeks, and you can see much more healthier plants and better growth when it's every 4 weeks. Another solution is, I'm going to run out of time, guys, is organic food, right?